go. Right on, Eric. Thanks for being with us. So I'll just give you a little introduction. You are a pretty interesting guy. You're an architect, a green architect, and you wrote this book too, right? Green Building for Dummies and a few other books for dummies.
I've written 4 books, the Green Building for Dummies book, and then the last 2 were Sustainable School Architecture and Green Sense for the Home.
Great.
Different publishers, but yeah.
And in addition to being an all-around interesting guy, you've got some pretty interesting views that you shared with me back at West Coast Green about forget trying to beg people to talk them into doing something green. Let's just force them to do it. Let's pass legislation. And I think that's a pretty interesting point of view. And I want to hear more what you have to say.
Of the people, 300 million Americans, I'm going to train them all and have them change their behavior. That's how we're going to solve this environmental crisis. That seems kind of silly now in hindsight. But that's what we've been doing for the last 30 years. We've been trying to get everybody on board to change their behavior. And I just find it's much more effective that they don't know what's good for them. Let's just force it on them.
Sure. Now, because you've done all this research, let's talk just for a second about what the case is for, tell us some of the facts that you've seen about climate change, the things that are glaring out that make this a real black and white issue for you.
Well, the other thing that shifted for me was in the last 3 years specifically, a large amount of data, new updated data came in that revised a series of projections. Before 3 years ago, prior to the last 3 years, the projections were we can still make these cuts in time and not really feel it. But starting about 3 years ago, all of those projections turned out to be much worse than we thought. It turns out that the scientists were actually too conservative in their projections. They were really overly optimistic, and everything was actually much worse than we thought. And it was just wave after wave of bad news. We're already feeling the effects of climate change. The last 18 months of weather has been the most extreme weather in the history of mankind. And individually, these could be seen as, flukes, really. They could be dismissed as kind of one-off occurrences. But when you look at the combined 2010 and now most of 2011, which is shaping up to be worse than last year, it's really quite striking.
And when you say flukes, that's how the media's portraying it, right? Like, oh, we've got this crazy Katrina, and then this crazy tsunami. Well, tsunami is not a climate change issue, but the different tornadoes that we've had and the huge hurricanes on the East Coast this summer, they're all flukes. Just a strange big storm.
Yeah, but if you look at them as a scientist would, all of these elements combined. Okay, last year was the hottest year on record, tied with 2005. If you get the top 10 hottest years of the century, they've all occurred, they've all occurred in the last decade. We've had the wettest year on land in history. Tennessee had a 1 in 1,000 year flood.
Hey,
wrath of God.
We had a great ski season out here in California. It was amazing.
Yeah, sure. But you wouldn't be saying that if you were in Chicago when they had what they called Snowmageddon.
No.
And people had to abandon their cars on Lakeshore Drive in February and just walk home because it was so bad. If you remember, a quarter of Pakistan was underwater due to high-pressure weather causing floods. Deadliest heat wave in human history in Moscow. Third worst hurricane season in human history. Half of southern China is in drought. Worst drought in 200 years. And the drought is so bad, the fish are still flopping on dry earth beds. They didn't have time to escape. That's how quickly it came on. In the southwest region over Phoenix, they had the strongest storms in U.S. history. The Amazon rainforest had its second 100-year drought just 5 years apart.
Wow.
I mean, it's just all these things combined is, getting back to your point, it's too late. We're already feeling the effects of climate change.
If you were the president or the king or the dictator and you got to say how it was going to be, you wave your magic wand, what kind of changes would you legislate?
Well, that's a bit of a loaded question because in part you could argue that no president really has the kind of power that we think they do.
True.
I really think mayors and governors seem to have more power in terms of enacting true change than the president does, who seems now that if we have a Democratic president, a Republican Congress will block everything they say. If we have a Republican president, a Democratic Congress will block everything they say. And they're at a stalemate. But assuming that, let's say our elected officials, the 535 people in Washington, actually were to do the job that we've hired them to do, and you could make change, it's easy. Not easy, but it's clear. The I don't know, the $10 billion a year that we spend on oil and coal subsidies, we could flip that and put it into solar and wind subsidies. So if you don't want to flip it,
that's a fact that I'm not wildly familiar with, and I would imagine that not many people are. You're saying that we spend $10 billion a year on oil and coal subsidies?
Yes.
Is that in terms of like tax incentives or tax rebates, or is that just pure cash subsidies?
Both.
Both. Okay.
And here's what's great. In April, Senator Chuck Schumer had proposed cutting them, and the 5 largest oil companies in the world met and testified in front of Congress, and they said in very guarded language, but they said pretty clearly, well, if you don't give us these tax breaks that we've come to become used to and love and trust, we might have to take our business elsewhere. They were openly threatening senators, really, with this. If you're not going to give us these things,
they're not going to give.
If you're not going to give us these, yeah, we'll maybe you won't have the oil that you really need. That's the trouble. I mean, we are addicts, and like any addicts, we don't want to piss off our dealer, because at any point, our dealer could then say, "Well, I'll take my merchandise elsewhere."
Interesting. So you're saying that these 5 largest oil companies in the world came to Congress and said, if you threaten us with taking away these tax incentives, we'll just cut our supply to the U.S. More. Yeah,
and our operations and all the other things. And the real sad part is that just 5 years before, the same guys, it was Rex Tillerson from Exxon and I forget all their names now. The guy from ConocoPhillips and Mobil, and 5 years before, when they were asked about these things, they said, "What? We have record profits. We don't need any of those incentives." That's what they said 5 years ago, and now suddenly, with the threat of them going away, they're singing a different tune. It's a little frustrating.
Yeah. Okay, great. So back to the magic wand. I'm curious to know what Eric Corey Freed would do if he could wave his magic wand and pass the laws that we need to keep us from heading to sort of a doom and gloom of climate change.
Well, first of all, we can't. It's too late. That's for you.
So forget it.
No, not forget it. It's just it's too late to make the cuts to avoid feeling any of the effects of climate change.
Okay.
Because we're already feeling the effects of climate change. All we can do now is lessen the impact, embrace for impact. And if you look, there's been a whole slew of new books, The Great Disruption, Long Emergency, these really kind of well done books telling people you need to prepare for this because it's already happening. So I guess in getting back to your point of what would my magic wand be, we need to make deep cuts, and not, I'm talking about in taxes, we need to make deep cuts in terms of how we use fossil fuels. And the worst part is we couldn't scale up fast enough to do what we need to do. You couldn't put solar on every rooftop overnight. It would take years to produce that many panels. But at the same time, you'd create lots of industry and lots of jobs for the U.S. So maybe that could be a good thing.
And is that even a solution? If you scale up and you put solar, and all of a sudden we're powering the U.S. on sunlight or on wind energy, is that
it's only partial?
But
it's half the problem.
Well, does it create its own problems? Do we wind up having?
Well, it would, because there's a lot of energy and pollution created from making solar panels. So that's. But also, the solar panels only fix the electrical side of the equation. Mm-hmm. What you do with your buildings. Most of our cars don't run on electricity, so we'd still be addicted to oil. We have no alternative for oil. You can't just pump biodiesel into a normal engine. You need at least a diesel engine that you convert over. But that's we have this giant infrastructure, 300 million cars in the U.S. that run on
petrol,
gasoline. So what are you going to do? Scrap all those cars and get everybody to buy electric cars? That's not really feasible. So we're in for a rough road ahead. I mean, that's really kind of the point that I've mentally prepared myself for. And for me, I have a 3-year-old daughter. If I really think about it, I stay up at night just stressing about the world that she has to inherit. I mean, at least I'll be old and dead, but by 2050, if things just keep continuing the way they are, and there's no indication to show that they're not, it's going to be pretty bleak. But I don't want to be depressing. But that's you asked. So that's
without being depressing, I mean, paint the picture for us for our children. I've got a son who's 18 months. What does that look like 50 years down the road? Or I guess that's just even 30 years.
Yeah, it's not 50 years. Well, the weather patterns we're seeing in the last 18 months are just going to keep continuing. The storms are just going to keep getting more extreme, more severe, greater challenges in terms of heat and cold, greater extremes in terms of those things. And then, of course, a greater demand for energy to make sure that we can survive. When you have giant heat waves in Texas, their electrical bills go up because suddenly you need to air condition even more than you would before, which has the strange irony of causing us to consume more fossil fuels. So the next 30 years are essentially, things are going to get a heck of a lot worse, and that's the point when we'll finally change. Winston Churchill has this famous quote, and he said, I always count on Americans to do the right thing, but only after they've exhausted every other possible option. And that's what's going to happen. That's our history. That's always been our history. We're going to hold out to the very end and then finally do something about it when it's going to cost us a heck of a lot more to deal with. I mean, think about Hurricane Katrina. The government knew the levees were weak. They needed repair. We put it off. Finally, they failed, and now it ended up costing us 10 times as much. Not to mention all the lives that were either lost or at the very least uprooted. That's what's going to happen. You're already seeing it. You're seeing environmental refugees today. Right now there's 1.1 billion people that don't have access to fresh drinking water. We're going through it now. I just don't think most Americans realize that it's happening now. I think most people think, well, if climate change is real, it's a distant thing our grandchildren will worry about, which is still pretty crappy to dump on them, but it's not. It's all happening now, and I'd like to think that this is the greatest challenge that we've ever faced, and therefore the greatest opportunity to innovate our ways out of it, and that's really the last thing that we can hope for. And I think that in those terms, because otherwise I'd be crying and rocking in the fetal position all the time. I mean, I'd be pretty upset. So I'm trying to look at it as I'm excited because it's our greatest challenge we've ever faced, and now's the time to do something about it.
And what can you recommend to young architects and young green building professionals that are beginning their career and looking at a lifetime of dealing with this? What kind of opportunities lie for them?
The opportunity is that you get to reimagine and re-envision what buildings are like. I'm now of the mindset, I'm not a gardener. I don't like to stick my hands in the dirt. I don't like to play with plants and whatnot. But I now am fully convinced that I'm now going to be responsible for growing at least a portion of our own food, and that every building is going to start to reflect this. You're going to see farming, for lack of a better word, be reintegrated back into urban life. It's going to have to be, because the idea that we're shipping this food 1,800 miles on average all over the U.S., we can't afford it anymore, and food prices are just going to keep going up, especially now that we're having disruptions in the rest of the world. With southern China and half of southern China in drought, China announced for the first time that they're going to start importing food, and they've never needed to do that before, but now they have to. And just the announcement of it caused food prices to skyrocket all over the world. That's kind of the sad side effect of globalization, is that what happens in one country really does affect everybody else now, because we've all wedded our futures and fortunes together.
And that's an interesting one. I mean, largely the U.S. and the industrialized West is responsible for the consumption of fossil fuels and causing this climate change. But moving forward, the areas you're talking about in Asia and China in particular are going to be huge contributors. I mean, is there any hope? I think I just read an article that they have 100 buildings now that have been green certified, but they're also building the equivalent of a new Chicago every year until 2030. I mean, think about that. A city the size of Chicago every year. And
they have 400 million people that are going to be born in this next decade, and that's more than the entire. It's 1.33 times the size of the U.S. that's about to be born. That are just coming, whether we like it or not.
So in
next month, Mark.
In terms of globalization,
I'm sorry, I was just going to say.
Go ahead. Go for it, Eric.
I was just going to say next month on Halloween. Oddly enough, on Halloween, October 31st is when we're going to pass 7 billion in population.
Wow.
According to the population clock, and it's just kind of a strange milestone that also marks that just in my lifetime the population of the Earth has doubled, which is a little strange.
That's very strange. Wow. Yeah. You're older than I thought you were.
Thank you.
But in terms of this globalization, is there even anything? Can we even have an impact in the U.S. with other parts of the world having such huge growth in population?
Well, we've been feeling this globalization in the built environment for the last 15 years or so, because as we've outsourced most of our industry, mostly to China, but to other countries, we've now had our material prices at the whim of the global market. So in the old days, the U.S. made its own steel. Mm-hmm. It made its own Portland cement for concrete. So other than regionally, it didn't matter what the rest of the world was doing because we had our own. Now we import all of that. So if China suddenly needs much more steel, and they need lots of it, and they need much more Portland cement, and they're consuming most of it because they're building a Chicago every year, suddenly we're seeing our prices just triple just in the last decade. So that's the part of globalization that nobody really likes to talk about. It's great for the corporations because suddenly they have cheap labor to do their bidding, but it's bad for everybody else because suddenly we're all kind of wedded together price-wise. And now with food, that becomes suddenly a human rights issue. So I don't know if there's a solution other than trying to back out or undo some of the globalization efforts that have been going on for the last 30 years.
Okay, so to wrap this up, I'm going to ask you the tough question. Are there any?
Well, the others weren't tough.
The other ones weren't tough. Those were the easy ones. Do you have any
easy ones?
Do you have any answers? Do you have any recommendations? Any suggestions or tips?
I have a few. Yeah. Recommendation-wise, I would essentially say that anybody who's not actively working to fix this stuff is really in our way and working against us. And you don't need to wait until you're experienced or comfortable. I meet a lot of young people who want to get involved in this, and they want to do something to help save the planet because, after all, they're the ones that are going to bear the brunt of it. And my advice to them is the same advice I guess I'm going to offer here, which is that don't wait. we can't have you wait. I mean, we need you to go now, do it now, start now. If you don't need to wait till you're comfortable and confident in your own skills. You can learn along the way. Think of it as on-the-job training. I mean, really, just pick a problem and just race towards it as quickly as possible and find ways to solve it. And you also need to remember you don't need to do it alone. I mean, we really work well if we utilize and leverage each other's efforts. So there's a lot of amazing things going on, and as I said, if I'm clear-headed about it, it's an exciting time. If I let myself get depressed about it, it's really just a dreadful time. So let's stay focused, let's stay optimistic, and really let's see this as the opportunity that it really is to fix the mistakes of the Industrial Revolution and move forward.
Great.